La mujer de Terach preñada estaba. La mujer de Terach preñada estaba. Y día en día ella se demudaba. Y día en día ella se demudaba. Y ella no sabía cuál lo quería. Y ella no sabía cuál lo quería. Salía por los campos con la pedrida. Salía por los campos con la pedrida. Dolores tenía, parir quería. Dolores tenía, parir quería. Ande lo pariera en la meara, verdando y escribiendo en la yeshiva. Transe jutuvitesh, signor parido. Transe jutuvitesh, signor parido. Afirmatesh la mitzvah d'Avraham Avinu. Afirmatesh la mitzvah d'Avraham Avinu.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to our panel. We're very happy to have you here today. This is an event of the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion Jewish Language Project, and it's part of a broader series on documenting endangered Jewish languages, which is co-sponsored by the USC Kasdan Institute. And today we have a wonderful panel for you, which is part of our broader efforts to convene conversations across organizations and individuals who are doing the very important work of documenting endangered Jewish languages. And today in our conversation, you might hear some terminology. So I just wanted to give you a heads up about the distinction between vernacular and post-vernacular engagement. Post-vernacular is a term coined by Jeffrey Chandler in his work about Yiddish today. And he defines this term as engaging with a language in a way that is not simply having a conversation in the language, but the fact that something is said in the language is perhaps more significant than what is actually said in the language. And I think you'll hear in our conversation today that contemporary Ladino engagement is both vernacular and post-vernacular. And I'm going to turn our conversation over to Ora Schwarzwald from Israel, who is going to be moderating our conversation today. Ora?
Thank you very much, Sarah. I thought you were going to ask the questions, but everybody received the questions and knows how to respond to the questions that were posed to them before.
Oh, yes, and no, I can ask the questions. That's fine.
Right.
Okay,
right.
So do you want to introduce the speakers or should I?
No, I'll introduce the speakers in the alphabetical order.
Okay.
And but yeah.
And I'll ask the questions after that. That sounds good.
Okay. The first speaker is Derya Agis. She is a linguist from the University of the People in Turkey. Amado Bortnik. I didn't say.
Let's do it one at a time. So let's.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead. Are you posing the questions?
Daria is going to do her introduction as soon as she unmutes. Go ahead, Daria.
Okay, I'm Daria Agis. Currently, I'm teaching at the University of the People online. I'm teaching English and world literature. I'm interested in Judeo-Spanish, and I have been conducting researches about this language. I have published both of my MA theses about this language. The first one was about idioms and proverbs, about body parts, and the other was one on pink angels. Besides, I published also a book about studies on Judeo-Spanish. Currently, I have been conducting a study on plants and animals in the Judeo-Spanish language. I will share my screen for now. Okay. Thus, I have these two surveys. The first one is about plants. I'm asking several questions to Judeo-Spanish speakers on it. And the second one is on animals. The questions are as follows. First of all, I'm asking beliefs about plants. For instance, which flowers, trees, and herbs do you use as ornaments and why? Or which flowers, trees, and herbs do you regard as sacred and why? Besides, I'm asking other questions. Which ornaments are used for meals and why? I have these questions to the Spanish speakers. For meals and which plants are cures? These are my questions. I'm trying to find different cures for different illnesses according to Sephardim. My second survey is about animals and different approaches towards animals according to the Sephardic culture. I'm investigating the beliefs, anecdotes, proverbs, and idioms about animals as well. Therefore, I'm interested in these issues nowadays. So I'm looking for people who will complete these two surveys. Nowadays, I will conduct an eco-linguistic study. Thus, idioms and proverbs are especially important. Besides, I'm looking for ways of analyzing climate change influences in the Sephardic culture. Thus, anecdotes, proverbs, and idioms are crucial for my study for nowadays, and I'm looking for participants.
Okay, thank you, Derya. And we
Thank you
will
very much.
send out those links in the follow-up email from this this event. Okay, go ahead, Ora.
Very good. Now, Rachel Amado Bortnik, she's the founder of the Ladinokomunita, and you probably all know about this group. Okay. Rachel, go ahead.
Wait, can I just say, can we stop sharing the original screen so we can see Rachel up close?
Yes.
Hello, everybody. While you're doing that,
Right.
it's nice to see everybody. Thank you, Ora. You say that pretty much everybody knows about Ladinokomunita. In that case, that doesn't leave me much. No, I'm kidding.
No.
I am unmuted, right? Okay. Yes, in 1999, I attended a Congress in Jerusalem, organized by the Autoridad Nacional del Ladino, the National Authority for Ladino in English, and I could tell you what that is if people don't know later, on the subject of how to transcribe or transliterate or write Ladino in Latin letters. Because at the time, all kinds of different kinds of spellings were used. except for Aki Yerushalayim, the review, which was at the time tri-monthly, as I remember, that had standardized a way of spelling the language in Latin letters. And so we voted at that conference that we would adopt this spelling system. And to promote it, Moshe Shaul had suggested that we could use the internet. And when I came back from that was October of 1999, I asked a few friends if they would join me to start a conversation group online. And that was the birth of Ladinokomunita, and we're still going strong. I just looked and we had 56,567 messages, all in Ladino. And that does not include the hundreds of extra files that we have of longer articles and attachments with pictures and music and so on. So that's Ladinokomunita. Lately, I have also taught Ladino online for the Sephardic Brotherhood of America. And most lately, just completed, is I had a class called Meldaremos con Rachel, which means let's read with Rachel. And my students read a play and we recorded it. And I can put the link on, we just last night, it was the extra parts were edited out and I put it on YouTube so people can see it or hear it. It's an original play written in 1939 in Geneva, Switzerland, but obviously by somebody who was born and raised in Istanbul. So that was great practice, I thought, for the students who practiced it outside of class and so before the recording. And that was a lot of fun. I have also previously, I don't know how many of you know, I had formed a group in the San Francisco area of California called Los Amigos Sefaradis when we lived there. And at that time, I had helped Judith Frankel of blessed memory, who was a fantastic singer, who specialized in Sephardic song with pronunciation. And I continue to do that also. I help singers, most recently, Carla Berg did a wonderful video for Hanukkah, and I could give you the website of that also in Ladino. So I do that kind of thing and I help wherever I can. So
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're turning, and I hope you give the site of this.
Okay, I will send
We'll send that in the follow-up email too.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Okay. Judith Cohen, who is ethnomusicologist. She is a performer at York University in Canada. And I think we heard the first song was yours. Was it?
Yes, thank you so much, Ora, and thanks, Sarah, for putting that on. And I had the honor of singing two really short songs in the play that Rachel just mentioned, because they were actually mentioned in the script, and I remembered that Buena Sarfati Garfinkel of Salonika had sung them for me, so I sang the versions I learned from her. That was really exciting. So I'm an ethnomusicologist. It's a kind of combination of, it's kind of like anthropology of music, basically. I'm also a performer. I work both inside academia and outside academia. This is my living room. I work in research, teaching, and as research, I teach part-time at York University, but I don't teach Jewish music usually there. I work as an ethnomusicologist researcher. I'm also trained as a medievalist. I work in Sephardic music, which was my dissertation and the focus of most of my publications. Music among crypto-Jews in Portugal. I've worked with them for 25 years. Use of music in so-called medieval festivals in Spain. comparative versions of old ballads, narrative ballads in Sephardic and other Portuguese, Spanish, and Pan-European traditions, research, teaching, performing. I work in a lot of non-Sephardic circles in Spain and Portugal and elsewhere. And so I also work on perceptions of Ladino songs. And I'm always saying, on the one hand, Ashkenazi is not synonymous with Jewish. And also, I try and integrate both Moroccan Sephardic songs and Eastern Ottoman Sephardic songs. What you heard in that recording was me singing a Turkish Sephardic song with a Moroccan violinist, Moroccan Jewish violinist. And I also, last thing I wanted to say, I work a lot on demythologizing perceptions about Sephardic songs. Ladino songs are not medieval, although sometimes the words or the lyrics of the older ballads are, but not the songs that most people commonly hear. And they're not flamenco, and flamenco isn't medieval, and all Sephardic songs are not all passionate and spiritual and so on. They're the same wonderful mix that human beings are everywhere and song traditions are everywhere. And so the last final thing I want to say there is a song is not better or worse because it's 1,000 years old or 1,000 minutes old. A wonderful song is a wonderful song, and we're just really lucky that we have so many of them in this tradition.
Okay. Thank you very much, Judy. And we're turning to Bryan Kirschen, who is a linguist from Binghamton University in the United States. Go ahead, Bryan.
Thank you, Ora. Buenas tardes, Hanukkah Alegre. It's a pleasure to join you all. My work, I'm an associate professor at Binghamton University where I teach Spanish and linguistics, and I try to balance my research, my teaching, and my activism in regard to Judeo-Spanish. As a researcher, I'm a sociolinguist, so I'm curious about the ways in which speakers of Ladino utilize their Ladino today, construct it, perceive it, as well as contact with other varieties of the language and contact with Spanish as well, particularly in the United States. I've been able to do field work in a number of communities where there's still vibrant Sephardic life and language as well. As far as some of the activism that I've been doing, which always overlaps with either research or teaching, back at UCLA, when I was a graduate student there, I helped co-found UC Ladino, a student organization that continues to hold meetings and conferences, symposia. And now at Binghamton University, I co-direct the Ladino laboratory with my colleague Dina Danon, and we work with students. We have a civic engagement component where we set up Ladino language apprenticeships where students work with native speakers of the language, some of whom are in attendance today. I as well have a documenting Judeo-Spanish website for the students or speakers, educators who want to learn how to read Solitreo, the cursive Hebrew-like variety of the language that Sephardic Jews used for their Ladino for centuries. And I also work a lot with the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America and the American Sephardi Federation to hold annual Ladino days, or whatever we want to call them, some that are coming up. And for the American Sephardi Federation, I work with Jane Mushabak on now our 5th program. As far as teaching, I have taught a number of courses either at the university in different formats, workshops. I also have a separate platform that I run through the Ladino Linguist, where I've worked with hundreds of speaker students at a variety of levels as well, trying to create new ways to have speakers and learners use their language.
Thank you very much, Bryan.
Thank you.
We're turning to David Naar, who is a historian, and he works at the University of Washington. Go ahead, David.
Thank you very much, Ora, and thank you, Sarah, for organizing this, and thank you to my co-panelists as well. For me, in terms of my work, I'm the Isaac Al-Hadef Professor of Sephardic Studies at the University of Washington, where I chair the Sephardic Studies program. So in terms of my research, one of my main interests as a historian is to bring forward the history of Ladino-speaking Jews in their own words. So what I'm very interested in, my first book, Jewish Salonika, Between the Ottoman Empire and Modern Greece, was telling the story of the Sephardic Jews of Salonika, which was once the largest Ladino-speaking center in the world, through sources written in their own language, in our own language. And that's something that I'm continuing in my new project as well, that looks at the dispersal of Sephardic Jews and especially their arrival in the United States. So looking at how do Sephardic Jews represent their world in their own language. And what does that mean, and how does that help us understand their historical experiences and their relation to the broader societies in which they live? One of my main public-facing initiatives has been, as the chair of the Sephardic Studies program at UW, not only to put on a number of public events, which have now been on Zoom recently. We have our Ladino Day program coming up next Sunday, and I hope people will join us for that program. One of our main initiatives has been to bring forward source materials written in the Ladino language. So we have, over the last 9 or 10 years, working with the local community in Seattle, undertaken a very vast project to catalog, digitize, and render publicly accessible thousands of pages of Ladino materials. We have over 400 titles of Ladino publications, and hundreds and hundreds of other documents, and some oral histories and songs, and some other kinds of formats of sources as well. Our hope is to bring all of these sources out online to create access for people to be able to see what Ladino looks like historically, and to be able to come into contact with the language, with the literature, with the written and other records of Ladino-speaking communities. And finally, for me, my activism is also related to comes from a very personal place. I'm the grandchild of Ladino-speaking Jews from Salonika, and it's a language that I heard growing up, and it is a language and a world that inspired me on my professional path. And I consider it not only something that brings me great joy and interest, but I consider it also an area of existential work here. It is a domain of politics, because we're talking about representation and power, and what gets to be talked about and what does not, and what languages get to be spoken and studied and what do not. And so I'm interested in changing the structures within Jewish academia and the Jewish community more generally, and in other domains as well, to bring greater attention, focus, resources to the Ladino-speaking universe. And so for me, that's become a very important mission, as I also attempt to transmit Ladino to my own 2 small children, who now sometimes argue with each other in Ladino. So I feel like I've accomplished something.
Very nice, very nice. Are the texts in Rashi script as well?
Pardon me? Yes, in Rashi script, yes. We have mostly texts from the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries, all different genres.
Okay, thank you. We turn now to Ray Romano, who is also a linguist from the University of Houston, downtown. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's Romero.
What did I say? I made a mistake.
It's okay. I did my PhD in Josh University, and in order to do my dissertation, I did field work in Istanbul. And so a lot of my knowledge and background in Ladino comes from the community in Istanbul. I'm also associate professor at University of Houston downtown, where I teach translation and linguistics. As a linguist, I started first looking at grammatical features of Judeo-Spanish, things like gender agreements, subjunctive, ser and estar, things like that. And I eventually moved to other areas of linguistics, such as social linguistics. And for Judeo-Spanish, I was very interested in seeing where the language was spoken, by whom, and any issues of intergenerational transmission. So I focused primarily on the differences of Judeo-Spanish between the younger generation and the older generation, see how the language was changing. Now, my current research, I'm focusing a lot on giving a social justice lens to language revitalization efforts. I am very interested in seeing who leads the revitalization efforts. Is it a top-down approach? Is it a bottom-up approach? In other words, who gets to decide who leads these campaigns, who leads these programs to keep the language alive, and also how to manage the inclusion of all the different varieties of the language. Like if you're going to put something or put something online or print something, or have, for instance, a translation into Judeo-Spanish, who gets to decide what kind of script, what kind of words are included, which kind of words are excluded, which varieties benefit from these efforts, which varieties do not benefit. One of the things I've noticed is that many times you are going to encounter some sort of situation where you're going to have very few speakers who speak a lot of varieties. And so trying to reach a compromise will be difficult. It will require a lot of work. And so that's kind of what I'm looking at right now. And I'm focusing, as far as linguistics and translation, I'm focusing on the translation of several works, how it is that these translations decided things like word choice, script, and it's kind of interesting too, because nowadays we've seen a lot of new works, literary works that have been translated, things from El Principico, El Quijote, Las Aventuras de Alicia. So all of that is very important, because when you put something on print, the power of the printed word, it is incredible how much it can influence the community, how much it can influence what words stayed and which words are forgotten. So that's kind of what I'm doing right now. I look at other issues of community leadership and inclusion, things like gatekeeping, things like Rachel mentioned, for instance, the standard alphabet. How is it that these things come about and how they get implemented? And I'm happy to be here, and happy Hanukkah to everyone.
Okay, thank you very much. Romero.
Romero.
Romero. Sorry for my mistake. I want to describe a little bit of what's being done in Israel and by me before we go on to the discussion. Just a minute. I want to see the full screen. Can you see it? Yeah. Okay. I'm from Bar-Ilan University, and first of all, I want to show you the institutions that work in Israel. I'm involved in all three of them. The National Authority for Ladino and its Culture, headed by Tamar Alexander, the Salty Institute for the Study of Ladino, and the National Ladino Academy in Israel, which is new. The National Authority for Ladino and its Culture was established in 1997 in Israel, very active in publishing books and records, organizing lectures, special days, and International Ladino Days, and also recording informants, also supporting Ladino activities. I just wanted to show you one of the books that they published.
Ora, we can't see your slides. We're still on the first one, so maybe try the presenter mode again. I think it didn't work for us.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'll try it again. Okay. Can you see it? Can you see it now?
Well, it's still on the first slide, so I mean, it's still not in presenter mode. Let's try it again and try doing presenter mode from here, and we'll see if we can see it.
Here, it's the presented
mode.
mode.
Yeah, it's not. So, okay, so then try unsharing, stopping the share and putting it in presenter mode, and then sharing the presenter mode app.
What do you mean by presenter mode?
Well, why don't you just stay in the PowerPoint?
In this mode. Okay. Yes, can you see that?
Yes.
Can you see that?
Let's go to the next slide and we'll see if we can see it.
Okay.
Yes, now we can see it. That's good. Thank you.
The national, okay, I'm not repeating it. I just wanted to show you one of the records, the children records that were done. It's called Ladino, Ladino for Ladino children. Children's songs translated into Ladino. For instance, Vuestra madre apareja mesa elegant, venga, venga, honrada, un Shabbat de menucha, ven aquí, la reina, venga, venga, honrada, un Shabbat de menucha, ven aquí, la reina. Okay, just a glimpse. We go on to the Salty Institute for the Study of Ladino. Oh, I forgot to mention, I'm on the board of the Authority of Ladinos, the National Authority of Ladino. the Salta Institute for the Study of Ladino. I teach there. I'm involved also in other projects related to it. It has many.
Oh, sorry, Ora, you got very quiet. I don't know what happened with the sound, but if you could just talk a little louder, that would be great.
Okay.
Oh, maybe you turned down the volume when you were playing the music?
No.
Okay, well, it's hard to hear you now. Go ahead.
The Salty Institute, there is a graduate school, graduate courses, PhD students, MA students, and also elementary courses of Ladino. Next, we have the National Academy of the Ladino National Academy, which was established only in 2020. It's part, an independent part of the National Authority of Ladino. I'm the president, and so far we were able to do a few things, among them, Las Ortografías de Ladino, setting the way to write both in Hebrew and in Hebrew script and in Latin script in a systematic way. Now, there are two journals in Israel. One is Naar, which publishes in Hebrew and in other languages. I'm the editor. And El Presente at Ben-Gurion University, which also include many, many articles on Ladino. Naar only publishes only things on Ladino. Now, Ladino is taught at Bar-Ilan University, Ben-Gurion University, and the Hebrew University. There are textbooks written by Cohen Serrano and Moshe Shaul in Latin script, whereas Bunis's and Gomel and Raphael are written in Hebrew Rashi script to enable the students to do research. Dictionaries, you know, the Peretz and Pimienta and Cohen Serrano, they're very popular. There is a lot of documentation done in Israel, written text and oral traditions. They're in the Phonoteca in the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. There is a lot of material, and there are publications like existing text from the past, like Musical for Purim or Seder Nashim that I edited, recordings and transcriptions and original text, some right original text, and there are done some new translations to old texts. Now, research is done on written and oral materials in all these areas. Conferences, there is a biannual conference on Judeo-Spanish. It started in England. Now it's done in turns in Spain, in Israel at Bar-Ilan, and in Portugal. There are special sections on Ladino and on the International Congress of Jewish Languages in Jerusalem, and of course in the World Congress on Jewish Studies. HUC-JIR is a well-known periodical. Now it's online, and there are many performances. Matilda Cohen Serrano is a person, one person who publishes a lot of materials, of recordings, and lately she published a conversation book, and you can see how Una Visita is done. There is the Ladino International Day, monthly events, Marathon Ladino, and many other activities in Israel. And a look to the future, the most important thing is documentation, both of the written text and of the oral traditions, and teaching the language and its treasures is a very important issue that we think should be done. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I'm going now to turn to our panel conversation, and I'll just summarize what we just heard, that there's a lot going on right now in the documentation and revitalization of Ladino. We have a lot of documentation work of Ladino language and culture, curricular materials and Ladino classes, performances of music in Ladino, translations to and from Ladino, and publications, conferences, and internet groups in and about Ladino. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. We also have other scholars and activists joining us today, and I hope that they'll participate in the open discussion we're going to have after our panel discussion right now. So my first question for our panelists is, what additional documentation work is necessary, both of Ottoman Sephardic language and culture and of post-migration practices in Americas, Israel, and elsewhere? And I'm going to start by, I'm going to ask Devin to go first in that question.
This is a big question, Sarah. I think there's many domains in which more documentation efforts could be undertaken. I mean, I think Ora was very right in mentioning the very important Hebrew Ladino dictionaries, but we do not have a really extensive English Ladino dictionary, nor do we have a Ladino dictionary. And I think some kind of, for me, what would be like when I'm with my kids and I'm trying to speak to them, and sometimes I don't know a word, or I'm reading them a book in English, and I always read to them, I give them a simultaneous translation into Ladino as I'm going through it. And if I don't know a word, well, it's kind of I stop and I go through the stack of dictionaries, the Hebrew ones, the French ones, until I find the word. It would be a lot easier if there was something in English, not only for me, but also for my students, that would really provide also not only the access to the terminology and the vocabulary, but also sort of, I would like to see some kind of historical development of the language, and also to touch on some of the other points, some dialectical representations, so that we can get a sense of the full range of the language, its varieties, and how it changed over time and according to place. And for me, that would really, really be an important contribution that would, I think, set a baseline that would enable more efforts to be undertaken. Not to say this is the way to do Ladino, but these are all of the many different ways, competing ways, dialects, and everything like that. I think that would be a very, very important contribution. There are many more, but I'll just start with that one.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
just a small comment. There is a dictionary by Passy, you know.
Sure. Yeah.
And
it's a start.
By Gordon.
Those are starts.
Right, starts, and they're not thorough. Right.
Yeah, they're good. I use those I go to because English is easier, but you know, it doesn't have all those other elements. It doesn't have Hebrew language. It doesn't have the transformations. It doesn't have examples. So
Okay, I'm going to add Bryan to this conversation. Go ahead, Bryan. What's missing? What do we need to do?
Well, I think that there's a lot already. I think that it's just a question of documentation for whom. I think that, you know, as a sociolinguist, I find a lot of articles on variation. I think it's just about creating resources for speakers and educators who want to use them. I mean, when we document, we are often, as at least in the academic world, creating academic articles that a very small group read or even have access to. So I think accessibility, creating resources, looking at, you know, all the periodicals that are out there, many that have already been digitized, but also I would like to see efforts on Ladino today. That's my primary area of interest. How are second generation, third generation communities using Ladino as well, and kind of find a way to use what was in the past and bring it to the present.
Okay, I'm going to turn this question to Daria now.
We need web applications, Android applications. I think we need dictionaries that we can reach online. Also, some games about Judeo-Spanish can be invented to learn Judeo-Spanish. We need applications, especially games for children, maybe for new generations.
Yes, great. Okay, Ray, I'm gonna ask the same question to you.
Yeah, I'm gonna agree with Devin, Bryan, and Daria. I really want to emphasize digitalization, like Bryan mentioned, because a lot of the modern issues that we have here regarding lexical, regarding words, regarding grammar, they can be solved because it's from earlier stages of the language, that when the language had a lot more speakers and a lot more creativity in that sense. So if we can get more and more documents digitized and more documents available, then those documents can be the source for any kind of, like for instance, maybe we don't need to create a new word for modern things because they're already there. It was already used. It was already well documented back in the 18 or 1900s. So another thing that we need to work on a lot is to do a realistic assessment. We cannot revitalize the language if we don't know where we are right now. And every community is going to be in a different place. So if we create materials for one community, it may not work for another community. So we really do need to be realistic in where the language is spoken, by whom, and maybe we're skipping steps. Maybe we need to go back a little and maybe focus a little bit more on culture and understanding different aspects of the culture, and then maybe move on to other aspects of the language after that. But we need to have a realistic assessment. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Rachel, I imagine you have something to add here too. You're muted still. There we go.
Okay. I agree with everything, of course. But as a person who does a lot of writing in Ladino, lately it seems like I can't write anything in English. Everybody wants it in Ladino, you know, if, a presentation or an article, it has to be in Ladino. So what I would like to see, you talked about digitalization and all that, but when I write something, I need internet, is it an app that I can dictate and it will type it out for me. I need something that does autocorrect. I need translation on Google, you know, from Ladino is not even listed anywhere. There was when I put on the play, when I put it on YouTube, it asked me what language to choose from a list of languages. And I went up and down a few times. There is no Ladino there. Ladino has to be recognized as a language online. And I also wanted to comment about studying communities. I think that we are at this point where there are really no Ladino speaking communities to speak of. Physical communities. Our community is digital. We are all connecting these wonderful, that I think nobody has talked about the wonderful encuentros de Alhad that we have every Sunday. That is totally in Ladino. We have had, I think today was the 63rd, and they're amazing. They're wonderful documentation projects, really, because it tells you who is speaking Ladino today and what the stage of Ladino is and what the proficiency of the speakers are and all kinds of things. Just go there and look. There is a lot of the documentation. We need to try to keep the language alive, to be used. And what Devin is doing with his children has to be a model for others. And we have to help in those efforts also. I think it was mentioned, children's books and games and all those things. There's a lot to do yet.
I'm going to turn to Judith, who might have something to add. Specifically, I was wondering, Judith, about music. What documentation work is still necessary regarding Ladino song?
Okay, thanks. So music is a problem because we don't have either recordings or written transcriptions of music from as far ago, as long ago as we have both recordings of spoken language, but also especially the written versions of the language. We just don't have it. So, the recordings that are available, there are a lot. Like Shoshana Vaishachak has put her whole collection basically online. My collection is at Hebrew University. It's not all cataloged yet, but a lot of it is, and more of it will be. But the problem is most recordings that people hear are actually made by people who don't speak the language, often don't even understand the language. And so the pronunciation and the idiomatic sense of the language is kind of all over the place. And then you also have, in any kind of song, you have the issue of what we call text underlays. So it's not enough to have a transcription. What you need is to hear how people are singing, what word goes under what note, what's emphasized. Because very often in Spanish and in Ladino and related languages, the way you speak isn't the way you sing. So you might accent in other words. For example, in the Balkans, you would say, estas casas tan hermosas, but you don't sing that in the song. You sing, estas casas tan hermosas. So you need to know what it actually sounds like. So we need a lot more explanation, a lot more workshops, a lot more live interaction, because it's not enough. It's essential, but not enough to have the recordings, the documentation, guides to them, transcriptions, and so on. We actually, in music, really, really need live interaction and a lot of understanding of styles from Izmir, styles from Salonika, styles from Morocco, styles from Bosnia and Herzegovina, and so on. And that's huge, and it's not something that one person can do.
Okay, Ora, let's see, what do you have to add here?
Well, first of all, for the YouTube, I suggest, Rachel, that you add Ladino to the title, and then you have it.
I did.
Oh, okay. So
yeah, I wrote Ladino to the title, but the thing is, it offered me, it's not in the list. There is a drop-down menu when you upload something. And for their, I guess it's for their documentation of what language we're using. And there is no Ladino there. There is no Judeo-Spanish. There's nothing.
I wanted to comment that in the academy, in the Ladino Academy, where the next projects are preparing specific dictionaries of in special areas, like in the kitchen terms, food terms, or game terms for children, games for children or games for adults, because we have card games and other things.
In the play, we have a card game.
Yeah, so we want these, and the fact that you suggest to have it, we have it in Hebrew and Ladino in Latin script, but perhaps we should add the English to the translations. That's a good idea. That's a good idea. I think it will be a good idea. Yeah.
Okay, now I'm going to ask a general question to the panel, and I'm going to bring you all up onto the screen. I'm wondering what we can do to collaborate here. It seems like there's a lot going on, and if all of you have suggestions for ways that we can better collaborate across organizations and individuals, please share that information with us now.
May I say something?
Yes, Rachel.
I want to emphasize something that Judith alluded to, and that is that there's singers somehow seeing themselves an authority on the language and on the songs, and they give the wrong information. I would like to see singers consult with speakers of the language and people who know the history before they say things like, this song is from medieval Spain and Ladino is the language that Jews spoke as in Spain before 1492 and things like that. You know, these things keep repeating and repeating, and people copy from each other, and it goes on. I would like to see like the brakes put on those things.
Yeah.
Good.
Can I add to that? Thanks, Rachel. I remember when I was beginning my work with festivals, music used in recreations or reimaginings of medieval festivals, somebody told me that they were singing a 14th century Sephardic song, and it was Hevenu Shalom Aleichem in its modern Israeli form. So that's a bit exaggerated, but I hear that all the time. So actually what I was going to say is disciplines really need to work together. So as an ethnomusicologist, if I didn't work with historians, linguists, anthropologists, I wouldn't get anywhere. I would do all the kinds of things that Rachel has just listed. And so people, it's not enough to have the material available. People actually have to listen to it. And also myths die really hard. So people like to say it's medieval, or they took their songs with them, or this hasn't changed. And it's always magically 500 years. I don't know if any of you have noticed that songs are never 531 years old or 486 years old. They're always exactly, precisely 500 years old, and they'll stay that way forever, which is, you know. And the other thing I wanted to just add, referring to children, is I totally agree we absolutely need a lot of material for children. But as someone who's worked a lot with children, as a teacher, as a performer, as an ethnomusicologist for many, many years, I would really have a plea not to make children's songs cute. Children are mostly brilliant. I know very few children who are not smarter than most adults. They can handle just about anything. They like good stories. They like great songs. They like good art. And if we reduce everything to things that are kind of cutesy, I don't think we're doing them a big service either in terms of their own education or in terms of Ladino and its culture. So I just wanted to add that one in.
Okay. That's a critic, and okay.
I think it's wonderful that we can get together online. I just think this was the greatest thing that happened for Ladino, that we have this virtual community. I just love it. It makes me so happy to see so many people joining the Encontros del Had and being interested in the language. It's a great signal, I think, that it will live on online rather than in a physical space. And there's something, I don't know, politically very good about that, because we're a global community.
Absolutely. And it's a very good time in history to be revitalizing a language, because we have the internet and all of these technological advances. And in fact, in the chat, Renee Martin wrote, I'm a native Ladino speaker, and now Los Encontros de El Had is my community. So that is, and I'm sure people feel that way about Ladinokomunita too. So Bryan, you were about to say something.
Oh, I very much agree with the previous comments as well. I will say just one thing, Rachel, and I could go over this more with you later if you'd like. We contacted YouTube a number of times, so Ladino should be on the list of options. I know that I've transferred some videos and it should appear, which it's a small victory, but I'll take it. We'll take it. So other things, the Solo Treo font will be coming out, something I worked on with a student at Binghamton University. And it's taken a while, as a lot of things do, but it's going to be publicly accessible on a major platform and free for everyone to use sooner than later. As far as the question, though, that Sarah raised in regard to collaboration, something I didn't mention before is that the National Authority of Ladino in Israel has thought about this before, and a number of years ago, they established the Shadarim Project, which is a delegation of volunteers, activists, artists, and speakers throughout the world. That's something that I direct, and I think Daisy Sadaka Braverman.
With the initiative of Bryan, I have to add.
Well, but it's a collaborative initiative. Katya Schmidt is here as well. And so prior to the pandemic, we were meeting in Jerusalem every year, and now we have regular quarterly meetings. Other members in here actually have been members in the past as well. And it's to not just talk about what we're doing in our communities, but to really learn from that, because even though you can't copy and paste certain projects, I think it's really important to have communication and see what worked, what doesn't work. So that is something that I think that all speakers, whether they're in that group or not, are very aware of. And one other project that I wanted to mention that kind of touches upon the vernacular or post-vernacularity of Ladino is in regard to the Sephardic Adventure Camp in Washington. I know that in the past I have been a scholar in residence, as has Devin, and I'll be back there this summer. It's a group of over 100 kids, essentially, from elementary school to high school that get together and have fun and engage in Sephardic programming, religious, cultural, and even linguistics. So I know a lot of them are interested in Ladino. It's just a matter of finding ways that they use words here and there, even if not in full context or sentences, but just continue to bring back those words to their families.
Yeah, so that brings up a question about the balance between vernacular and post-vernacular engagement, right? When we're teaching, it seems like kids have come up a lot here in the materials that Ora talked about, and Devin's efforts to raise his children in Ladino and read books, translate them into Ladino as he's reading them. And so I'm wondering, what should the balance be between using the language and teaching it as a full language versus engaging with the language? And I've talked about in my research about Sephardic Adventure Camp and their use of Ladino word of the day and singing Ladino songs and using a Ladino quote on their banners in color war. And those kinds of post-vernacular engagement are perhaps a necessary first step in getting people more interested in learning to fully converse in the language. So I'm wondering from all of you, any of you, what do you see as the optimal balance between vernacular and post-vernacular engagement with Ladino?
I could address that.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, sorry.
Go ahead.
I mean, I think that the post-vernacular and the vernacular angle maybe have different possible audiences in mind. And so I think that that's really important when I think about it. So like when I think about my graduate students, they really need to be involved in the research angle. And so whether they need to be worrying about how to speak, if they want to learn how to speak, that's great, but that's not necessarily their primary objective. Whereas I think about my children, I would like them to be reading and speaking. And, I think one of the Encontros de Al-Had recently, Nessie Altaraz said something to the effect that speaking Ladino is performing your identity. Whatever language you speak, you're performing your identity. And so, for me, that's that would be another, like, to be constantly performing. Like every time you say something in Ladino, you are saying, I am being Sephardic right now, or something like that. I'm projecting some aspect of a Sephardic identity. And I think that that's very, very important from my perspective, but it also maybe blurs the boundaries between vernacular and post-vernacular in a certain way, because it's using the vernacular, but with also a post-vernacular goal in mind, which is to have that identity signification beyond the practicality of communication. And so I think it depends again on the particular audiences and who's engaging with the language, but I think there need to be both parallel paths and kind of collaborative paths when it relates to those two concepts.
Judith?
Hi, thanks for that, Devin. I'm reminded right away of when we put on musical theater, original musical theater in HUC-JIR in my old group, Gerineldo. And one of the classic, I guess we didn't see it that way, but now that I'm thinking of it, post-vernacular techniques was the letter in HUC-JIR. And what would happen with that is that it would be a really exaggerated version of HUC-JIR. People probably wouldn't speak that way. It would have every possible typical idiomatic expression and allusion and in-joke and so on crammed into, 2 paragraphs, which then would be read out and declaimed on stage. So there's that aspect, and how much does it actually reflect the language? And also the fact that it's, the norms that are being established, and I see this in minority languages, say in Spain all the time. They create new norms for Catalan, new norms for Galician, new norms for Basque, and then the grandparents say they don't understand what's being said because that's not how they spoke Gallego or Euskera or Catalan or Valenciano or Ibicenco or whatever in their village. So I'm wondering whether that's happening and it's a necessary stage in Ladino. And as someone from outside, because I'm Ashkenazi, so unlike Rachel, I didn't grow up hearing Izmirli Ladino. I've heard all kinds of different Ladino, which is probably why I don't really speak it very well, because I say to myself, am I going to speak like so-and-so from Istanbul, or so-and-so from Çanakkale, or so-and-so from Sarajevo, or a Haketia kind of thing. And just going back to what Sarah, I think, said at the beginning of this question, do we use songs as signifiers and to bring the Ladino more to presence? I have to go back again to the thing I said earlier. How do we bring songs in? We're going to listen to, at the end, an experiment that my colleague, whom I admire immensely for her work, Sarah, does with flamenco. And it's a really interesting combination. It's fascinating. But do we want that as an example of what a Ladino song is that we're going to put on as a kind of, post-vernacular signifier for people to identify with it? So just tossing those out there.
Okay, thank you, Ray.
Yeah, actually, I had a very similar comment to Judith. The main difference is that right now in the post-vernacular world, we're living in an era where Spanish is a global language. And so that's really going to affect the revitalization efforts of a dialect of Spanish, Judeo-Spanish, because many times we may have to force ourselves to create distinctions that were not really there in the language from the beginning. And so we were, even Rachel was complaining that there was no Ladino category on YouTube, but my question is it different enough to be a different category? And I know the symbolism behind it of having a separate entry in Wikipedia, in Google Translate, and all of that. But what are we creating when we do that? And I feel like that's the main question between the vernacular and the post-vernacular, because now we need to consider that Spanish is out there, it's spoken. The kids who are learning Judeo-Spanish, when they go out there in the world, they're going to encounter Spanish. What are they going to do with that? Are they going to change that? And then another thing I wanted to say is that, Spanish as a global language can also be a source to help this post-vernacular world. You can very much, Sephardim who already are fluent in Spanish can also learn to adapt Judeo-Spanish features, but it has to be realistic and it has to be based somewhere. And I think that base should come from the vernacular documents, vernacular world. I think Rachel wanted to reply to my.
Yes.
Okay, Rachel, and then Devin, and then we'll turn to Daria. Go ahead.
One of your questions was, I don't think it was articulated, was what are some of the challenges? And I just put the word Castilian there because obviously Castilian, or so-called normative Spanish, or whatever you want to call it, is an enormously useful and spoken by, I don't know, what is it, 500 million people around the world. And so many Sephardic people have said before, and some still do, that what's the use of learning Ladino? Learn modern Spanish instead. I would never teach my children Ladino. I would teach them, it's documented in a film. Somebody from Istanbul said exactly that I would never teach my children Ladino. I'd teach them Spanish so they can use it in the world. So the big challenge is the fact that Spanish is so widespread, and Spanish speakers have a particularly hard time keeping Ladino separate from it's in fact today's encontro was related to that, in that there have been Sephardic people in the past, way back in the 19th century, who wanted to purify, so-called, our language and make it more Spanish. But the point is that all these things that we spoke about, that we are doing and can do and should be doing and hope to have in the future, is to should preserve the particularities of our language in whatever dialect. And yes, there are differences, and it may be almost impossible to make an all-inclusive dictionary. But I myself have been collecting and I don't know when it'll be completed, but of the particularities of the Izmirli dialect, which is quite different from the Istanbuli dialect. And I sent that list to John Evrensel, who's working on the dictionary, and my incomplete list, because I'm still adding to it, to be included in the online dictionary. But those are all good, and they can be indicated so that people who have ancestors from Izmir can see, you know, oh, in Izmir, that's why my grandfather said that, you know, because that was an Izmirli saying. By the way, speaking of food, before this program started, you had something that said what we say when we're eating, Sarah. You had a thing, and I want to add to that saying that's more popular than what you have. So I'm going to send it to you. It's Berajay Salud, and that is so Ladino. I mean, how much more Ladino can it be? Berajay.
We'll add one. We'll add one. So we're almost out of time for the panel because I want to leave time for the Q&A. So let's go with Devin and then Daria. Go ahead.
I think some crossword puzzles may help new generations understand Ladino. There can be questions about history. The historical facts can attire new generations to learn Ladino. I think, therefore, word puzzles, crosswords, yes. And these can be applications, of course, modern applications, so they can attract new generations to play with them.
Nice. Okay, Devin.
Well, I would say, you know, with looking at how my kids are engaging with the language, we had a big question come up whether there are some, bilingual schools, public schools in the area for heritage speakers of language. So we had a big debate. Is our children heritage speakers of a Spanish? Like, it's also complicated because I'm a heritage listener, not even a speaker, you know. So we took we signed up our older son for the test, and they start speaking them in Spanish. He says, "Baba, están hablando en español, hablamos en Ladino," and he essentially boycotted the test. And so they said, "So what? He doesn't speak anything?" And I said, "Well." We tried to explain, you know, and the teachers had never heard of Ladino. They were native Spanish speakers. They never heard of Sephardic Jews. They never heard of any of it at all, which was mixed with a discourse of, oh, we're so inclusive and we want to respect all of the cultures and all this kind of stuff. And so that was very interesting. And eventually what I found, my older son, he can code switch already because he's been exposed to enough Spanish. So he can say the colors, you know, in Spanish, and he can say them in Ladino, and he can say, I mean, right now we have a babysitter with our kids, and I heard them, they were talking to the ear, and he doesn't speak like he speaks with me. He speaks with her in Spanish. I never heard him speak Spanish to me. He speaks whatever this language he speaks to me that's more Ladino based. So it's really fascinating, I think, the double-edgedness of Castilian. As it's sort of like literally actually playing out in my life. It's like a battle in our home in some ways, but it's also a great asset.
Okay, I invite everyone to put things in the chat while Ora makes one final comment here. Put questions in the chat that you want the speakers to address. Go ahead, Ora.
Okay. I want to be a little realistic. We have many groups. In Israel, we have on Facebook a few groups that deal with the word of the day in Ladino, and there are Sephardic groups that don't discuss specifically Ladino, but rather any non-Ashkenazi tradition. So that's also a problem. And I want to add the attitude of the general public, of the general Sephardic Ladino heritage public. Not all of them see the importance of the language. Not all of them see the necessity to have the reservation of that culture, of that language, and that tradition. I know it from my own experience. When I told my parents that I'm starting to do research on Ladino and Judeo-Spanish, they asked me, why Judeo-Spanish? Why not Spanish? That was their reaction, because they didn't see it as an important language that needs to be inherited. And that's very sad in a way. So we are academics, and we see the importance of keeping the language, keeping the tradition, keeping the communities as they are, but we have to expand it and to change the attitude towards the language to the public, to the general public, not just to our group. And that's the important thing.
Yeah, and I do think it has changed. I think in the last decade or so, I've seen so much more positive ideological conversation about Ladino. And at the Jewish Language Project, we receive many questions. A lot of them are about Ladino and asking to connect to scholars of Ladino. Now, the conversation here has brought up issues of boundaries between Ladino and Castilian. And also, I mean, you could ask those same questions about various dialects of Spanish. Is Puerto Rican Spanish the same language as Argentinian Spanish, for example? And but another question of boundaries that didn't totally arise to the surface is the question of Sephardi versus Ashkenazi, Jew versus non-Jew. And Devin, I think you made a point at one point about speaking Ladino is pointing to your Sephardic identity. But for many people, it's not pointing to their own Sephardic identity, but rather to their interest in Sephardic identity. And you have the same phenomenon with Yiddish, with many non-Jews interested in Yiddish and learning Yiddish. So I'm wondering what panelists have to say about all that.
I don't know how many people
One of the best teachers of Ladino at Bar-Ilan University is Nivi Gomel, who is Ashkenazi, and she speaks fluent Ladino.
I was going to say, in terms of music, I found that being from, it doesn't matter if I'm Ashkenazi or just not Sephardic, because I guess what it is, but being from outside the culture means that I listen to, and I've interviewed a lot of different Sephardic kinds of music and kinds of speech. So I'm not limited to just one. None of them will be perfect. One of the wonderful Moroccan singers I interviewed in the 80s once said to me, no matter how well you sing and no matter how well you learn to speak and pronounce and everything else are songs, there's going to be a gap. There's going to be a gap between, you know, what you grew up with and what you absorbed as a child and what you learn as an adult. But I think that gap is true for many Sephardic people who grow up without speaking the language and learn it as an adult. And I wrote into the chat an anecdote about a well-known Sephardic singer. So, you know, sometimes being from the tradition is not necessarily an advantage in learning specific aspects of it. But on the other hand, I will never express my identity as a person like Devin does by speaking Ladino. I'll express, as Sarah suggests, my identity as somebody who's identified really most of my adult life by now with studying and promoting and disseminating Sephardic culture.
Our dear Bryan is a wonderful example of somebody who loves Ladino, teaches it, and is not from that culture, and and does so much for us, for all of us, him included. But in my classes, I've had many Spanish speakers who are not even Jewish at all. And their interest in Ladino is historical and also Spanish related. And they are wonderful. And in the play, the two main characters who are wonderful Jews who want to instill Judaism in their son were played by non-Jews, were read by non-Jews, and they just thought nothing of it. I mean, it's just part of the whole experience, and I think that's wonderful. I love having
Bryan.
Spanish speakers.
Yes. Bryan and then Devin.
Brian.
Sure, thank you, Rachel. Learning Ladino and being Ashkenazi, right, or not Sephardic, in many ways has brought me closer to Judaism. And I think that in teaching lots of students or learners, I find that that's quite common. A lot of the people that I work with who are Sephardic, they want to reclaim the language of their family or at least practice it. A lot of Ashkenazi Jews or just non-Sephardim want to have another way to engage with Judaism somehow, or a Jewish language, maybe one that they never heard of. Maybe if they're not even Jewish, as many of my students are, they want to learn about a Jewish language or utilize their Spanish as a platform to learn a new variety of Spanish, well, Judeo-Spanish. And then I see also with teaching, it's bringing a lot of new questions to new forms of Ladino. This is something that Ray mentioned before and has worked on as well. Questions about language inclusivity, questions about how do you express gender in Ladino, and some kind of questions that languages are seeing and communities are seeing today that maybe were never discussed in the past. But I also want to say that, I see that within the past 15, 20 years or so, it's this great movement really that has been facilitated by scholars and speakers working together and creating new opportunities. I know when I started working and trying to interview speakers of Ladino, I was met with resistance, not just because I was not Sephardic, but also just because there was somebody from the outside who wanted to learn about Ladino. I mean, this is well documented, the history of, Sephardim around the world. And for many, they didn't speak Ladino. They couldn't speak Ladino. Callades, right? I remember, just to conclude my little piece now, is that a number of years ago when I met with a Ladino speaker in her 90s, I showed up to her house, I'm like, all right, I want to speak to you in Ladino. This is so exciting. Why doesn't everyone want to learn Ladino? And she said to me, it's because I saw my parents in the concentration camps. I saw my parents being killed. When I speak this language, I have these memories from the past. I don't want to speak Ladino. Ladino is the past for me. This brings back memories that I don't want to revisit. So I know everyone's experience is quite different, but I think also for older generations, it meant something completely different than it might for newer generations of learners and speakers.
Thank you, Devin, and then Ray.
Great. Yeah. I mean, I think to build off these last comments, I think that there's really a question here about, authority and authenticity. And this goes back to something that Ray mentioned earlier, like who is in the driver's seat here. And I think that there needs to be a coalition effort. I think everybody and anybody who is interested in raising the status and the legitimacy of the language should be brought in to fight that fight, because it really is a fight, despite all of the accomplishments that have been achieved and the wider recognition. Like, it's still, in terms of institutional support and all of the different kinds of things that there could be to support the language and the culture, there's a lot that's still left behind. But I think for me, it comes down, it's not just something that is nice and fun, although it is also that there is this very deep ideological element and an existential element. When I speak Ladino with my children, it's a repudiation, in fact, of the choices that my parents and my grandparents made, or the ways that they were forced to abandon the language as a result of the pressures of assimilation and, of white supremacy in the United States, and of the forces of nationalism in any context, whether it's the United States, Israel, it's the same. It's no different. Greece is the same. Turkey is the same. All of these states that have armies and they have schools and they have institutions and they have ideological practices were all set up with the intention of not making space for Ladino.
And they have
And
national
so-
languages.
Right, national languages, and so Ladino as a, I don't know, it's a non-national language, it's a transnational language. It's as Joseph Nehama said during World War I, it's the organic Esperanto of the Mediterranean. Whatever you want to call it, like this is a fundamentally ideological question, I think, in some ways about the place and the future of the language in these broader political and power dynamics.
I also just want to say, when I interviewed Yoram Gaon in the early 1990s, he actually told me that as a child, when they were in Israel, they weren't allowed to speak Ladino because and many people told me this, many people, because Hebrew had to be emphasized, and modern Hebrew of the new state had to be emphasized in, as did many other Sephardim. He spoke Ladino only with his grandmother. And so, as we all know, his Ladino has a very Israeli kind of accent. So there's that aspect also. And Yiddish had a lot of the same, the same problems. And so it's sometimes also just that aspect, because if someone as iconic as Yoram Gaon, could tell me that in the early 90s, that says a lot for what happened to the language of that generation.
Yeah. So one more comment by Ray, and then we have a quick question about Duolingo before we wrap up the program. Go ahead, Ray.
Yeah, just a quick comment regarding that we also need to be, as researchers, we need to be very introspective about whether or not we are promoting any kind of stereotypes or any kind of wrong idea of the language when we go out there to perform, to give talks, when we publish articles. We need to kind of like sit down and think, like, what is it that is what I'm doing actually creating, like Devin said, authenticity in the language. So for instance, in linguistics, in Spanish linguistics, Bryan, you probably know about this, many times in Spanish linguistics textbooks, they will put Judeo-Spanish section in the historical part. What does that say? That says that it's a medieval language, that it's just, they call it frozen in time, that is still frozen in time. One great way we can change that is by putting Judeo-Spanish in the modern, when we discuss different dialects, when we talk about Puerto Rican Spanish, Cuban Spanish, Argentinian Spanish, let's talk about Judeo-Spanish too there, not back in the Middle Ages when El Cid was roaming around or all that stuff. So those little changes do say a lot about where we want the language, how we want the language to be perceived. If it's going to be in the Middle Ages, that's what's going to stay. So, again, we need to be very introspective, look at the research, look at what we're doing, and see what kind of effect it has.
And also a plea to not just include anybody singing any song any old way in Ladino as an example of what, the language and the music are.
Well, it's an interesting question, because do we want to present the language as it was in the past or as it is evolving today, right? And so I think musicians who are presenting Ladino songs in modern form with hybrid styles are doing exactly what is done in language revitalization efforts in many languages.
No, actually, Sarah, I'm going to interrupt you. They're not. I work with a lot of traditions. What I see is people studying Balkan music to do really authentic Balkan singing, studying Yiddish and klezmer to do really authentic Yiddish and klezmer singing, for good or for bad.
Yes.
But in Ladino music, anything goes. And the problem is that most of the changes are not coming from inside the culture. They're not coming from evolving. Those are great. That's fine. People have done that. Jews and everybody else in the world have done that forever. They've evolved. They've learned new tunes. They've learned new styles. That's why music changes. But what I'm talking about is people who know nothing or next to nothing about the culture and just doing it because they want to add it to their kind of musical curriculum vitae. And that's not a different style or an evolving style. It has nothing to do with the culture. It doesn't have to be someone who's from it. But there's a big difference between people who know a culture making changes and people who know nothing about it just tossing things in.
Right. Well, I would say that there are these trends in language revitalization efforts in many languages, both the traditional historical styles and the new styles. There are hip hop recordings in various indigenous languages throughout the Americas. And
not a problem, but they know what they're doing is what I'm saying. I work with people from indigenous cultures. They learn the language from their grandparents. They know what they're doing. They're making a conscious way to update. That's great. It's terrific. It's not a problem.
Yeah,
that's not what I'm talking about.
Unfortunately, we're out of time here. I know everyone has so much more to say. Okay, Rachel, one more comment. Go ahead.
just that what Judith is referring to, I think, is also the representation of Ladino songs in indigenous Spanish styles like flamenco or period, medieval styles, that kind of thing, and presenting them as if those are, the authentic or the roots of our music.
Thank you, Rachel.
That's
It's
what
not what people do, it's what they say about what they do that concerns me. So someone says, as a friend of mine says, I'm from a Sephardic culture. I was trained in opera. This is how I sing it. Great. But if somebody says, this is how it's done authentically, that's a whole other story. So thanks, Rachel. You really cleared that up.
Okay, well, the quick question is about Duolingo, and there's been a lot of chat in the chat about Duolingo, and the question for you all is there any, so Gabor Sabo talked about working on a Ladino version of Duolingo, and have others worked on it? Are there others who are interested in collaborating on that? And I hope that we'll continue that conversation, and also conversations about online dictionaries in the works and all that. So does anyone have any quick comments about Duolingo?
I don't know Duolingo, and I don't know much about apps, but I do know that I recorded together with Benny Aguado for UTalk, which is an app for learning Ladino. So there is that. That's all I'll say.
Okay. Okay, great. So I am now going to turn it over to Hannah Pressman, the Director of Education and Engagement for the Jewish Language Project, to wrap up our conversation today.
Thank you, Dr. Benor, and thank you again to all of the panelists for a truly illuminating discussion. As a student of Ladino myself, I feel really inspired by the depth of knowledge that these scholars have curated and the care they have invested in preserving Ladino for students like me and for future generations. So merci mucho, thank you very much. If you enjoyed today's discussion and now you're curious and want to learn some Ladino yourself, you should enter our raffle to win a private Zoom lesson. That's right, the Jewish Language Project is currently holding a raffle to raise funds for the Endangered Language Alliance, a wonderful nonprofit based in New York City that is helping us to document endangered Jewish languages. So we're offering 2 raffle prizes this month, a language lesson with the legend Rachel Amado Bortnick, who spoke on today's panel, and also a lesson in Sephardic musical traditions with Sarah Aroesti, a groundbreaking composer and singer. And I think Dr. Benor is putting the fundraiser link in the chat, yeah? So when you go to the Rally Up site, you can indicate which of these 2 prizes you'd like to enter to win. Tickets are $10 each, and there's no limit on the number of entries. And if you prefer, you can also just donate to the fundraiser without entering the contest. Our campaign ends on December 9th, and we're about 20% of the way towards our $1,000 goal. So please consider a donation to support the Endangered Language Alliance. Thank you. Like many Jewish Language Project events, today's panel offered different disciplinary perspectives from scholars based in several countries to shed light on an important topic. And that, in fact, is one of our main goals as a research organization, to regularly convene experts to share their findings and thereby raise awareness of Jewish languages, both their rich history and their current precariousness. Next month, I'm happy to announce that we'll be launching a new series, excuse me, on languages of the Jews of Iran. And Dr. Benor has put together a truly remarkable slate of scholars and performers to give a comprehensive historical picture, as well as a window onto contemporary language activists. Let me repeat, there will be music. So we're very excited about that upcoming series. So I encourage you to go to our event hub, jewishlanguages.org/events, to see the full program schedule. The first event in the Iran series is coming up pretty soon on January 9th, and will feature 3 scholars with an overview from medieval Judeo-Persian to today. And I'm thrilled to announce that that event on January 9th will end with the Zoom premiere of a new song in Judeo-Isfahani by Dr. Galit Dardashti, who is a renowned performer, scholar, and innovator in the sphere of Persian Jewish music. So we thought it would be